Hey folks, this is Mike Luce telling you how not to make comics. Okay, all joking aside, it's just that my process is a little weird and for a lot of people kind of backwards. Things like composition actually are one of my last steps. So don't follow me, but if you're interested in how I make things, let's get started. In case anyone was wondering, I do have a few comics under my belt. I've done two long-form comics, Fight and The City Dreams of Tamino the Cat. I also have a short-form comic called Harlan, a selection of short stories, and an ongoing journal comic, Biography. I'm currently working on that, a D&D comic called Giroy, and the comic I'll be talking about here, The City Silent. I use a mixture of traditional and digital media. My specific tools are a sketch pad, illustration board, a very short 2H pencil, plastic eraser, sable nylon brush, Speedball Super Black ink, an iMac computer, image capture software for my Epson scanner, Photoshop, Super Vectorizer, and Affinity Designer. With the exception of the computer, everything is pretty much on the cheap because, well, I'm cheap. Most people making comics start with a script of some kind. I've never done this. I think there's a real value in doing this sort of thing and plotting things out. It's just not something that works for me. The newest comic I'm working on, called The City Silent, is actually going to be a musical. Not really a musical, I guess. There's no real music in it, but it's told only through lyrics, which I guess makes it an opera. I started off with this comic by writing the songs out, a total currently of 25 or so. Once I was done with those, I made a little template for thumbnails. So far I've only sketched out the opening 26 pages or so. These are very loose and may only be the vaguest suggestions of what the final page will be. This is so I don't get bored. Comics is a long haul kind of thing, so whatever you need to do to get through it is a good choice. Here's the thumbnail for this page, page 6. There's a scribble, then my text as to what's going on. From there I start with some mental pictures and then it's off to the costume. I pose for most of my own character reference photos, and since this character dresses pretty much like me, it's easy enough. I take photos and video for poses and angles I think I'll need. Then I choose the ones I like best and get to drawing. Sometimes need to draw things a few times before I get what I want. That's part of the process. It might also be a way of subconsciously telling myself something isn't working. I pencil figures out on 11 by 14 board as I like to draw big. From there it's off to the drawing table for inking. One of these characters takes about a half an hour to ink. One of the things I like about ink is that I don't have that undo button. I make my mark and move on. If it's not quite right, I can fix it a little, but that's it. Having undo just makes me use it over and over until the line's perfect. I'd never get anything done. I still need my pencil and paper, ink and brush, because I love the feedback and feel of those traditional media, and since I've used them for so long, I'm a good deal faster with ink than I would be with something like Photoshop. Doesn't matter, whatever works best for any given artist is the right tool. The opening of this comic is going to take place in the kind of coffeehouse nightclub that was big in the 60s and which is probably considered hipster now. I was inspired by the movie Bell, Book and Candle and its Zodiac Club. I didn't want to use that directly, so I went looking for signs of nightclubs from the same time period. This gave me some ideas, and soon the page was going to have a sign of the club bisecting it. I don't really like panels or word balloons, so this would work well to cut up the space. I liked the idea that some of the old signs were actually made from even older signs, their neon removed and their flat surfaces just painted over. I chose a name based on a character from another comic I did, and set up the lettering in Affinity Designer. I hate just using digital fonts as they look really fake, but lettering by hand is way too time-consuming. So I did both. Turns out the black ink from my printer will rub off, so I reversed the lettering, printed it out, and rubbed it onto a piece of board. From there, I just outlined it with my fountain pen, not wanting to get too exact at all. This gave me what I wanted. Pencil lines are erased, the image is scanned. And then it's brought into Photoshop just for touch-up and some playing about with brightness and contrast, so I can drop out any remaining pencil lines and heighten the depth of the black ink. From there, I drop the image into Super Vectorizer, which does a great job of turning my drawing into vectors. I prefer to work with vectors rather than raster images like those in Photoshop and most art programs, because I can export my images at any resolution without loss of sharpness or clarity. Once I've exported the images into AI files, Supervectorizer doesn't translate directly into Designer, I can open them in Affinity Designer and start moving them about. I have a blank setup for this comic, a file with all the formatting and such I'll need for each page already set up. As long as I remember to save each page as a copy, I don't have to set each page up from scratch. Since I don't even have a basic composition set up, there's a lot of playing around, especially at this early step. It's all done with intuition, what feels and looks good. In this case, I want two Howard figures to be pretty big as it's meant to be an obvious continuation from the page before. The one idea I have cemented clearly is that sign cutting the page in half. Though I think I'm pretty definite in its placement, I can, and do, change my mind later. I like to keep my characters and background separate for this very reason. Easier to move things around and make changes or substitutions if I draw this way, though there can be a disconnect between the elements. The color palette is already pretty much set, based on this orange-gray, which is the color of the night sky above a city using sodium vapor or high crime lights. I love that color. Here I'm doing the coloring, making shapes from beneath the line work on a separate layer. I do the same thing with the characters, taking color cues from the previous page. I know there are ways to make custom palettes, I just don't know what they are and haven't taken the time to learn how. Having everything on separate layers means I can more easily edit and color these elements without having things in the way. I try to color from the back to the front to keep things in order. Thing is, I should probably have a lot more layers than I do. It can cause problems having so many shapes on one layer. This is how my head works, so even though I'll have a headache or two down the road, keeping the layers simple makes things easier to navigate in my head. With the upper part of the page more or less set, I have an idea for the lower right corner. To help draw attention to it, I'll color it against the palette above, making it blue-based instead of orange. This allows both a change of feeling as well as a visual pointer, a suggestion of depth, and a key to the color palette of the following pages. I can include a simplified version of the rooster sign so that the visual reference above will make more sense. The sign is also where the eye is drawn to first, so it can be a bit confusing, causing the reader to do a kind of hunt and search. At this point that's okay, as I hope it adds some of that chaotic city feeling to things. With that lower right corner more or less done, I realize what I want in the left corner, which is a sort of turnaround of the main character. The remaining space can represent a building corner that leads to the alley with the club. So it's back to the drawing table where I draw one more Howard, ink it, scan it, and vectorize it. That done, he can be placed on his own layer and manipulated like the other pieces. I use a copy of the background shape as a sort of cookie cutter. Again, I know there are ways to draw inside a shape, I just haven't put them into practice, and I really should. Now that I have all my elements, it's time to resize, shuffle, and move about some more. That lower corner is too small for my liking, too hard to see. Adjusting it, though, makes me realize that I have a large blank space which bothers me. Do I have all the elements I'll need? Nope, one more. What could go there? It occurs to me that the kind of hipster bar club this would be would certainly have a logo of some kind. So I do a quick search for 60s cornflakes mascots to sort of get that aesthetic in my head, and do a quick and dirty design, first in pencil, just to set things up. After that, I move into Affinity Designer for the design, using the color of the main sign as the key. I then realize there's a tool missing I need from Adobe Illustrator, so I export it there, fiddle with the perspective, then bring it back into the page for placement and outlining. One of the last things that's been bothering me is the shading of the background in the upper half. I like it darkened but don't want to lose the feeling of lit signs. So I move the parts that represent the lit parts to a layer above the shadowing layer and get the best of both worlds. This is pretty much it, so it's time to export. This is just for posting, so I make a JPEG file, bringing it into Photoshop for a final tweak. What I don't realize is that I won't be satisfied the next morning. Sometimes sleeping on a design or a page is a really good thing. Even getting up, walking away for a short while can make things obvious upon return that weren't so blatant while constantly working on something. In this case, the next morning I thought Howard in the lower left was too pale, and the logo for the rooster wasn't nearly blue enough to fit with the background. So I make yet one more edit and re-export it.
And there you go, how not to make comics. There's a lot to be said for working out all of these design elements and these story ideas ahead of time. It's just not something that works for me. I find a real value in being able to manipulate every last thing up until the last minute. But hey, there's no wrong way to make art, so whatever works for you is great. Thanks for hanging out and watching my video, and we'll see you later.